presumably, Bishop Barron, you're not a Christian, you're not a Catholic, just because of some great arguments that Aquinas made.
Right.
If someone stopped you on the street today and asked, "What is faith?" could you actually give a clear, confident answer? Most people struggle because the word gets thrown around so casually and usually dismissed as nothing more than a blind belief, a kind of wishful thinking without evidence. So to clarify this, in the first clip, Bishop Barron takes the aim at this confusion and tears down the false ideas and starts by showing us what faith is not. And that alone is going to shatter some of the cliches we have all heard repeated 1,000 times. Let's listen.
Right.
So what's the what for you is faith? Presumably it's more than just those intellectual arguments that obviously have been part of your journey along the way.
Let me start with a very quick little anecdote. I don't know if over in the UK you know Bill Maher's program. He's a very well-known kind of left-wing political and cultural commentator, fiercely atheist, hates religion. Well, one time he had a Christian on his show who was a political lobbyist. So they talked politics for a time. But then he said to him, "Now you're a man of faith." And he said, "Yes. That means you accept all kinds of things on the basis of no evidence." And the man said, "Yes." Well, I had the channel switcher in my hand, and I threw it at the camera, at the TV, because I thought, no, man, that's the whole problem. Paul Tillich, the great Protestant theologian, said faith is the most misunderstood word in the religious lexicon because it's construed just that way. Faith means some wild credulity, some crazy superstition, believing any old nonsense on the basis of nothing. That's not what faith is in our great people. That's not what faith is in Thomas Aquinas or Anselm or Augustine or any of the great figures.
From Bishop Barron's explanation, we as Christians now can confidently say that faith is not believing in something without evidence. So then the question becomes, what is faith according to Catholic teaching? Let's keep listening.
To put it simply, faith is never infra-rational. So superstition, gullibility, accepting any old nonsense, that's all infra-rational. I'm against that. The church is against that. It's superstitious nonsense. Faith, authentically construed, is always supra-rational. It's a surrender at the far side of reason. I think that the best analogy to it is in our coming to know a person, right? So I'm meeting both of you, at least virtually now for the first time. I watched videos of you. My mind was alive to see what you're like and listen to you talk, and I drew conclusions and so on. I hope someday I can meet you in person. I'll have an even more thorough knowledge of you. My mind will be fully engaged around that. But I mean, let's suppose we continued to get to know each other and we developed into real friends. Well, my mind has never gone to sleep in this process. My mind is still alive and awake and alert and studying. But at some point in that friendship, you would reveal something to me that I could never have learned through my own reason by reading about you or even talking to you or talking to others about you. You'd speak some truth about your life that I could never have guessed unless you had told me. And see, at that point, I have to make a decision whether I believe you or not. You could be making some crazy stuff up, I don't know, or you could be telling me the deepest truth of your heart. I have to decide at that point, do I believe you? Now, I haven't put reason to sleep at all. At no point in this process have I set reason aside. But at a key moment, if I really want to get to know you, I have to say, yeah, based on a lot of things and hunches and intuitions and experience and knowledge and what I've gathered about this person, I'm willing to say, yes, I believe that truth about you. That's an analogy, it seems to me, to religious faith, authentically construed, that we would hold, and we could talk about what this means. It doesn't mean voices coming out of clouds. That God speaks. If I accept things on the basis of no reason or no argument, it's just any old nonsense, that's credulity and superstition. But a surrender on the far side of reason to the self-revealing God, that's faith authentically construed, I think.
As Bishop Barron explains, faith is not infra-rational, some blind impulse beneath reason, but supernatural, existing on the far side of reason, elevating it and bringing it to completion, what reason alone cannot achieve. It is like a climber steadily led up a mountain by reason until the path ends. At the edge, the climber must leap, not into absurdity, but into trust, uniting heart and mind and surrender to God who reveals himself. That leap, which the world may see as reckless, is in fact the true flowering of reason, for it acknowledges both its own limits and the reliability of the one who calls us beyond them, and this, Catholic teaching says, is the essence of faith. Now you might be wondering, how could this clear explanation by Bishop Barron possibly be challenged? Well, Alex O'Connor, a popular atheist, takes a swing at it, arguing that if you already have enough reason to believe in something, then you don't actually need faith. And on the other hand, if you do not have sufficient reason but still cling to belief based on intuition or hunch, then that isn't faith at all. So in saying this, he tries to poke a hole in Bishop Barron's argument. Let's listen.
Well, I mean, look, I would put it rather plainly and say that with the proposition you put forward is quite a simple one. You know, someone you know puts forward a piece of information and you've got to decide whether to trust them or not. There are two options here. You're either basing this on some form of reason. That is, you say, listen, they've never lied to me before. Yep. I understand that this is a rational person. I know who they are. I know what their motives are. And therefore, I conclude that what they're saying is true. I wouldn't call that faith. I'd call that perfectly in line with what the average person would call reason. The other option is that you're doing it, as you describe, on a kind of hunch, an intuition. That is to say, lack of evidence. I would say that what you're describing there is either an instance of believing what they say because you have reason to do so, or believing what you say, or believing what they say despite having no reason to do so on a hunch or an intuition. If it's the first, then I'd just call it reason, and if it's the second, then I'm supposing you wouldn't call it faith.
To this challenge, Bishop Barron responds by saying that even if we do in fact have enough reason to place our trust in God, there still comes a decisive moment when reason alone cannot carry us across the threshold and we are confronted with the divine revelation itself. And in that moment, the human person must freely respond, must say with both heart and mind, yes, I believe. Let's listen to Bishop Barron's explanation.
No, take the first part of our conversation. So we've been going through some of these classical paths to God, which I think very convincingly show that belief in God or acceptance of God's existence is a reasonable position to hold. So when someone out of a religious tradition, so let's say out of the biblical tradition, says that God has spoken, and again, I'm not talking about voice from clouds, that's a symbol of what I'm talking about, that God has spoken, well, I have a very reasonable context for that claim, that God exists, and I can show, I think, by a number of steps too, that God is intelligent, that God has will, that God is connected to his world, that God has created the world out of love. Within that context, it makes perfect sense to say that God would want to communicate precisely in human history to his intelligent creatures. So that's not an unreasonable claim. It's in a reasonable context. And so I accept that. When I said hunch intuition, I really meant that sort of thing, that there's a context provided by reason for the claim that God has spoken. Now, what does it mean to say God has spoken? I rather like Paul Tillich's description of the breakthrough of the unconditioned into our ordinary experience. That's why a lot of contemporary theologians don't use classical arguments. They'll talk often about limit experiences. At the limit of our knowing, at the limit of our capacities, at the limit of our attainment, we often look toward that which transcends those limits, right? Hegel's line about to know a limit as a limit is already to be beyond the limit. At the limit, we gaze into what transcends that limit. Are there some people who have experienced the breakthrough of the unconditioned? That the unconditioned, being itself, if you want, God, speaks. God breaks through our ordinary experience. Faith is the sort of epistemological move that corresponds to that event. The Bible witnesses to those moments, it seems to me. Now, poets point in that direction often too, but the Bible witnesses to people that have had the experience of the breakthrough of the unconditioned.
Now, if you think this explanation is sufficient and airtight, Alex pushes back once more, claiming that Bishop Barron is really drawing a distinction between faith and reason without showing any real difference. In Alex's view, if you already have solid reasons to believe in God's existence, then faith seems unnecessary because reason has already done the heavy lifting. And if, on the other hand, you lack convincing reasons, then faith looks like nothing more than a fallback, a substitute to cover up the absence of evidence. In short, Alex's challenge is this: if reason is enough, faith is redundant, and if reason is not enough, then faith is irrational. So why claim there is a meaningful difference at all? Let's listen.
But I feel like, interesting as it may be, this is off track from the original point, which is to say, look, I mean, I think what you're making is a distinction without difference here. You say that faith needs to be distinct from reason, otherwise there's no point in having the term, right? We're talking about something that's distinct from the average kind of, here's a reason for believing something, so I believe it. And you've said, well, no, it's not that I kind of use reason to come to this conclusion, I just have a context of reason from which I arrive at this belief, is I think the terminology you used. I'm failing to see the distinction here. In other words, the question is quite simple. It's like, when it comes to something, some proposition which you would say you need faith to believe, whether that be a religious claim or a claim that a person you've met is making, you either have sufficient reason to believe what they're saying, in which case you're relying on reason, or you don't, in which case, sure, you're relying on faith, but then faith would entail a lack of sufficient reason. I feel like those are the only two options available to you.
In response to this challenge, Bishop Barron makes it clear that reason prepares the ground, it creates the context for faith, but reason by itself is never going to be enough to believe in God. That is why he explains the Bible does not lay out formal arguments for God's existence, because faith is not simply the conclusion of rational inquiry, but the free response of the human person to God who reveals himself, a response that requires reason. It also goes beyond it into that higher act we call faith. Let's listen.
Senses, because I think when that person speaks her heart to you, your reason is not in control. Your reason has prepared the way. Your reason provides a certain condition for the possibility. But accepting what she says, that has to be an act of real belief that goes beyond your capacity to control. See, one of the marks seems to me that differentiates a philosopher approaching God and one of the great biblical figures. Philosophers are always, for the most part, in control of the situation. They're proposing the premises, they're analyzing, they're proposing arguments, drawing conclusions. They're in the driver's seat epistemologically. The great biblical figures, you don't find anything like an argument for God's existence in the Bible, which is very interesting because they're very much in the passive voice. They've been addressed. They've been spoken to, you know. Isaiah's vision in the temple, that's a symbol of what it's like to be addressed by God. So it's not repugnant to reason. In fact, reason provides a context for that. But it goes beyond it. It's something that reason can't control on its own.
Finally, still unable to grasp Bishop Barron's point because of his atheist lens, Alex makes a last-ditch effort and asks Bishop Barron to give one-sentence definition of faith, and Bishop Barron delivers a true mic drop statement, one that I believe Catholics should hold on to as the definition of faith. Let's listen.
This I find to be telling, right? We have someone coming along and saying, listen, I am going to accept what can be reasonably shown to be the case, and systematic theology essentially rejecting it on the basis of it not being able to properly handle the content of their beliefs. I find it incredibly telling that when we try to apply this kind of analytic style of thinking to theological thought, the response is never to try and show why actually, you know, we can provide an analysis which shows that this is in keeping with our reasonable logical thinking, but rather to say that actually, you know, the methodology is inappropriate to use in this case, and we should be using this vague concept of faith instead, which I still haven't heard precisely defined from Bishop Barron, which would be quite helpful actually if rather than kind of talking around the subject as I think we've been doing here. I think it would be helpful to the listener and to me if we could have a sentence perhaps that sums up what faith is as a dictionary theological definition.
I mean, faith is a response to the revealing God.
Give us that again, Bishop Barron.
Faith is a response to the revealing God, the response of the whole self in the presence of the God who reveals himself. Now, that's not repugnant at all to what we were doing 20 minutes ago in talking rationally about God in terms of philosophical proofs. I think those are very effective ways to approach the mystery of God. But then there's the claim, the strange claim from the heart of religious traditions that God has spoken. which means God has revealed something of himself beyond what the mind on its own can grasp. Now, the mind can understand it. It can take it in, think about it. Faith seeking understanding, etc. But to make it more specific, in the Christian context, we're talking about the incarnation. We're talking about the Trinity. Two realities that reason can't on its own grasp, but were given to us, were revealed to us. And faith is the response of the entire person to the revealing God.
In conclusion, I would like to quote the Catechism, which clearly states in CCC 156, faith is by no means a blind impulse of the mind. To believe is no less than to assent to the truth freely and with full understanding of the one who reveals. And also, St. Pope John Paul II said, faith and reason are like two wings on which the human spirit rises to the contemplation of truth. And finally, St. Augustine said, I believe in order to understand, and I understand in order to believe. I hope this video is helpful. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section. God bless you.